this computer. Hello, everybody. We're back, and are we fun? As you know, I'm Dan Winter, fractalu.com, fractalfield.com, and newly phi-ray.com, and I'm here with Sara Pugh. Sara is amazing. She's passionate. She's articulate from UK. Sara, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, maybe?
Yes, thank you, Dan. I'm Sarah, and I started off as a biochemist, and then I did a PhD um, in protein folding and fluorescence. And I have to admit, I knew nothing about light, and I still don't really. Then I taught Pilates for 10 years, and I did hypnosis in that time. Then I went back to science and got into the world of quantum biology, which is water, light, and magnetism. And then I realized that gravity and charge were missing. And to cut a very long story short, this is a whirlwind tour of my life. I found the missing pieces of physics that I've been looking for a long time in Dan's work, because I've also been fascinated by things like telepathy, lucid dreaming, phenomena. And as I had a background as a scientist, I had to suppress this for a long time. And I was more than delighted to discover Dan's work to give a scientific explanation to what we playfully called woo-woo. And my mission is to de-woo-woofy science, to show everybody that telepathy's real, remote viewing's real, and hopefully we'll have a fun conversation today with Dan and myself, because of course I have lots of questions. And because I want to convey this work to not just lay people, but other scientists, I think sometimes we have to start from the ground up, and we'll just see where we go. I brought some props as well. I've got Dan's plasma fire and also a water vortex, a Vogel crystal, and an Enochian alphabet. So we don't know where this conversation's going to end up. And it's for everybody, new people, scientists, curious people, all sorts. So thank you, Dan, for this opportunity.
I think that might be our subtitle or bumper sticker for the today. We are going to de-woo-wify the scientists. Excellent, excellent. Hey, and speaking of just one little thought, so you were studying protein folding, and you know how we sort of did all that research about when you get the coherent heart sounds of love or bliss, heart coherence, you can actually measure the phonon cascade, trigger recursive implosive phase coherent braiding in DNA, which is a folding phenomena, like braid the thread to string to rope to fat rope in phase until it implodes. And then that compression is called having a soul. Do you think we could fit the physics to the metaphor there better now with
Oh,
your...
absolutely. Because the thing is, being a biologist, I did also do biochemistry at the same time to make proteins to fold. So we just thought DNA was this thing that we used to make proteins out of, and then to discover it's actually a radio and the braiding, and it's part of our soul. I think it's more, there's so many things we could talk about that's going to be aha moments for people, but absolutely the DNA radio. Because I think something also, you asked me beforehand, what am I passionate about?
Yeah.
And I think something, mitochondria fascinate me. And I was telling you before, they have DNA in them. And, some people say the mitochondria, or, in Star Wars, the mitochlorian and whatever they were called, are the force. So there's lots of ways we can take this. And also with your work and photosynthesis and how that's phase conjugation with the
Yes.
tilt on the photon, which we'll get into later about trying to define light, that massively fascinated me, because if a chloroplast uses phase conjugation to tell what color something is, so it can use the light, the rest of biology has to use phase conjugation in order to communicate, because the other important thing about biology is it's pretty much like you said, it's all longitudinal communication. Yet in our world, we have sort of radios and technology. And the other thing I'm passionate about is water, because some people would say that's a dipole antenna. So the idea of us being this phenomenal quantum wet biological, well, I don't want to say machine, because we have a soul. I think there's lots of interesting avenues that we could take all of that down.
Yes. Well, that's beautiful. You brought up all the good stuff. So yes, the mitochondria, we believe it is the fractality of the membrane, which they identified the first Eve in Africa, because the egg is more fractal than the seed. And so the recursive foldedness on the surface, which is called structural stability and morphogenesis, actually, that, you can tell if it's cancer, if it's a sphere, whereas if the membrane is fractal, the more harmonic rich it is, literally in wave mechanics, you can prove how long it's going to live by its harmonic inclusiveness. Again, that foldedness metaphor. And you're linking that so beautifully to, now that we've proven that photosynthesis absolutely only exists because of optical phase conjugation, specifically the only two very narrow notch frequency colors, purple and orange, that cause photosynthesis are exactly phase conjugate golden ratio to Planck. Hello, is that ever a smoking gun? So yes, that means phase conjugation is doing the implosion called photosynthesis. And what happens at the center of that implosion? Coherent longitudinal interferometry, the perfect mechanism of the DNA radio, which the fractality of hydrogen in the water means the water is sitting there hungrily waiting to eat the coherent longitudinal, which if you take our phi ray or of any of our plasma devices and put a little glass of water on there, the effect is dramatic because water loves to eat the coherent longitudinal.
Yeah, so I think, as we mentioned, the plasma device, I just wanted to showcase here, because we're going to be talking about the other thing, which this conversation will end up in, is talking about the ether and plasma as well, because, that's all very important as well. So
yes, and we wanted to go there in this conference, specifically, formerly the therify.net, now phiray.com. And actually, I'm going to bring up even that website right now because it's exactly where I wanted to go with this. Let's see if Firefox here. Let's see if my share window stuff works here. So if I look at the Therify website on the plasma effect on plant growth, remember, we're going to subtitle today's conversation, if science knew how to make anything centripetal, then, like gravity, life force, consciousness, then we could make coherent gravity, life force, consciousness, and zero-point energy. So taking the effect of centripetal charge, in the case of phase conjugate, plasma, dramatic measurements of the effect of this coherent plasma on plant growth. This started with Therify and extends to phi ray. So the metaphor we wanted to start with today was from planckfire.com. This is the background of the conversation, which is then going to be mostly the Q&A with Sara. The background of the conversation is, in my usual double Scorpio humility here, the catastrophic idiocy, I mean cost, of not tuning global wireless power to plasma fire charge collapse. In other words, if we don't know the cause of anything centripetal, which is obviously gravity, life force, consciousness, what causes seeds to grow, and the cause of zero-point energy, then the cost to our planet is appalling. So it is critical to be clear, here's what it costs, because of the apparent stupidity of the scientists who currently run your planet. Well, because of their ridiculous childish arrogance, refusing to learn the cause of gravity, why objects fall to the ground, they can't learn or facilitate the cause of anything centripetal. All require Planck fire, fractal implosive charge collapse, life force, consciousness, free energy, making a soul, and the list goes on. So these are the critical factors which make life: consciousness, soul making, gravity, atmospheric stability, all of which require specifically electrically generating centripetal force. If that specific skill is not taught to our science and government, this arrogance is literally fatal to the human condition. For example, then we're going to talk about how pyramids make stable gravity as a gravity diode that life force and seed germination require. In fact, it is now pretty much proven that almost all original stone circles and pyramids' primary function was to trigger seed germination. The book Seeds of Knowledge. The formation of consciousness and a soul. So we're talking about physicsofsoul.com here. So when that implosive charge, for example, in DNA and in human bliss and in glandular bliss experience, makes the body electrically centripetal, the body emits the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan, the rainbow light body. The coherent longitudinal plasma, whose radiance is measurably electrically the ability to lucid dream, therefore the ability to take memory through death, Therefore, the physics of soul.com. So we can't, our children, billions of them, are losing their soul rapidly because physics doesn't know how to teach children how to have a soul. Instead, physics is putting Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in the kids all night, every night, and chopping up, fractionating their soul. This is a catastrophe. And also all electronegativity and fusion energy, all zero-point energy require fusion and charge collapse. So I have just a few examples of each of these in this little slideshow, which was a warm-up to Sarah's questions. And finally, why would the Galactic Federation want to invite a backward, isolated consciousness of a planet like Earth until their pathetic, I'm sorry, am I being humble as usual? Until their pathetic science evolves to understand what fractal implosive plasma implosion makes planets, stars, galaxies, and the universe self-aware, the mechanism of source consciousness. In other words, if we don't understand where source consciousness and the collective soul comes from, we don't qualify. Hello. So this Planck fire tune plasma implosion is in fact the specific electrical mechanism which makes all stargates, portals, interstellar travel, electrogravitics, portals, stargate, and even lucid dreaming possible. And finally, with this specific stupidity, this is the reason our absurd cars and rockets are still today powered by dinosaurs farting. I think we should be embarrassed. Okay, I have some graphics, but so am I being too humble as usual? What do you think, Sarah?
I don't know. Well, the thing is, I'm a Sagittarius Cancer, so a double Scorpio. You're very different. No, I think it's the strange ideas that physicists have. Because not only people inventing particles like gravitons and squirmons and magneticons, that's another way to confuse people about gravity. And then the other thing about gravity is words like, oh, the center of gravity, when you're talking about balancing, that some people might think, why on earth are these two obsessed with gravity? And then as we walk you through, I wanted to ask more about, for example, you gave the seeds, and then in one of your other websites, it talks about how when a tree grows, it can tilt the angle of the vortex to change how much voltage it can be produced from gravity. That's correct? Yes, that. And also about the heart making gravity, and obviously we're in an epidemic of heart disease. Then, of course, somewhere along the line, the mitochondria must make gravity,
Yes.
and people might laugh their heads off about floating saints, because I was going to ask you about monoatomic gold and how people laughed away about experiments done when apparently it levitated. But there's plenty of anecdotal and video evidence of Grebennikov and the insect carcasses, and he floated. So in some ways, we want to, before we get too excited, maybe walk people through some key terms like capacitance, dielectrics, inertia, because I think that's where a lot of people get lost, because can get really excited at the idea of what we're going to be talking about, and also even mass and inertia. Maybe we could walk through that slowly, because another question I had for you was, I was thinking about Jean-Claude Moyen and the teleporting. So we must, of course, not really understand what mass or matter is if we can bilocate an entire person. So
Yes.
there's much more to this than, yes, of course, it's important to know why objects fall to the ground, but you can't understand all of the rest of the fun stuff without having to go back to the basics, understand what's phase conjugation, what's waves adding and multiplying, what's fractality. But fundamentally, a lot of people don't even know what inertia is, because if you look it up on the internet, it'll just tell you the resistance of a mass to be moved. Whereas when you're talking about inertia, you're meaning potential, I would imagine, and information. And then this idea, you also define mass as charge that's rotating and gaining inertia. And I just think that phrase alone, you think all physicists know that charge collapse causes consciousness and gravity. I would say probably 1% do. So we do need to
Yeah.
define the basic things that get people stuck on your work, because once you dig into it, you'll realize it's a missing piece of physics. Because if David Bohm knew, and I love David Bohm, if he knew about phase conjugation, it would have helped him unpack his holographic
Yeah,
universe.
that was the implied implicate order. The implicate order is what
Yes.
makes it negentropic self-organizing, which is fractal phase conjugate charge collapse. Absolutely. And but so let's take a few of your questions and try to deal with them with some brief discipline. So specifically,
Yes.
what they proved in field of form, vortex of life, Lawrence Edwards' famous biodynamic anthroposophic Steiner collection was that as the tree opens and closes that pine cone over the year, the pine cones are what's called a super dielectric. The seeds are high dielectric, which simply means that they're permissive to the efficient distribution of charge. How efficient is the sandwich in the capacitor? It's called dielectric constant. So high dielectric, for example, if your house is made of biologic high dielectrics, then your aura feels bliss. If your house is made of the opposite, steel and aluminum, you feel like merd. So the high dielectric seeds on the surface of the capacitor, called a pine cone, as they open and close, regulate the amount of charge implosion, which is the amount of voltage that tree is going to generate from gravity, called a gravity diode, which perfectly introduces the visuals I prepared on how a pyramid makes global wireless power. So the pyramid, in fact, maybe this is just the point. Excuse me, but I'd love an excuse to play the next slide in the slideshow. So here is the pyramid. It's called the gravity diode. The pyramid is tuned very accurately and specifically to this cascade, which is the Schumann harmonic cascade in green, 7.83, 14.3, 20 hertz. And that phase conjugate pump wave, almost exactly golden ratio times Planck, called planckfire.com, charge collapse tuned to perfection implosion. So the pyramid is here, this piezo structure, high dielectric and high piezo, and it's sitting there pumping the pump wave, called a gravity diode, named the Hummer, if you read the book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy, which is humming. Why? Because out the center of that implosive piezo is coming a coherent longitudinal interferometry, and that pumped out coherent longitudinal wave is the stuff, first of all, the definition of what gravity waves are made of, if you believe Tom Bearden's equation, and the only stuff of global wireless power and coherent longitudinal interferometry, the physics of all action at a distance. So this is a gravity diode exactly like the pine cone we were just talking about. So the ability to implode that capacitance, and that implosion is tuned by golden ratio multiples times Planck, because at the Planck length and time threshold, the definition of the dimensions of the tip of the only squirt gun that works, because at the tip of that squirt gun, defined by Planck, and that's why Planck is the same for 1,000,000 light years in all directions, is the transverse EMF is converted efficiently because of the adding and multiplying phase conjugation. And that implosion is also dumping out directional coherent longitudinal, specifically from the nozzle of the squirt gun, called Planck. And so that coherent longitudinal wave, which is simply the compressional component of the electromagnetic, and it's actually even intuitively obvious why that's the only thing gravity waves can be made of. If you've left the schizophrenia behind, thinking gravity is made of separate stuff, it ain't. Gravity is part of a unified field, which is called charge. And so the component of charge that can be part of what's called gravity, as Bearden explains in his whole book, Gravitobiology, is really simple, that the only part of the electromagnetic that actually can become centripetal ain't never the transverse. No, 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 no. It's always only the compressional or longitudinal, sometimes called scalar or torsional component. And when the compressional longitudinal components arrive symmetrically from opposite sides in a phase conjugate pump wave, then and only then does the compression become implosively centripetal, because, and this is the specific step which stumped Einstein, he knew there had to be infinite non-destructive compression for gravity to exist. He was right. And of course, he didn't know what a fractal was, not even to mention fractal charge. But because at the Planck threshold, the charge compression can emerge through the speed of light, and we can measure golden ratio multiplies times the speed of light, the longitudinal waves that go through Planck, there is then a way out for charge at the center. This was what Einstein could never figure out. Of course, he was stuck thinking that the speed of light was a speed limit, very childish. And he was stuck thinking that action at a distance was spooky. It's not spooky at all. When that longitudinal wave node, then it bounces at the other fractal nodes in the array, called the Earth grid, DNA Earth grid and zodiac, and the dominant geometry golden ratio of all orbital mechanics. At these nodes, the longitudinal compressional waves bounce and exchange inertia with the transverse, which is the only physics of all action at a distance, et cetera, et cetera. So bottom line is, if science understood that implosive compression, they then could have a clue to what makes anything negentropic. They could have a clue to what makes all zero-point energy devices work. They could have a clue to why seeds germinate. They could have a clue to why consciousness is electrically centripetal. And finally, they could develop zero-point energy technologies. And I prepared a slideshow about our fractal carbon nano. And remember, in carbon, fullerenes look like this. But I've carried on here a little too fast. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, that's great, because that I could follow, but then thinking back to my journey of where I started and then having this conversation, when it comes to describing an electromagnetic wave, we've obviously got a magnetic component, and then that's perpendicular, and then we've got the up and down component. So in terms of what light is and what charge is, because we've got magnetic, because I'm very interested in magnetism, so some kind of magnetism goes in to the vortex and then the longitudinal comes out. I just, maybe for the listeners or the watchers, if we could talk about what light is, and what when I was learning and you were saying, oh, waves go down the vortex, it took me a while to think, okay, we're talking about the world of the ether, and we're imagining a vortex, because people get very upset. Oh, point at the vortex, where is it? So yes. And then I think what flummoxes people also about light is that all of a sudden we talk about waves and then a photon appears, and there are different camps of scientists, some who say everything's just waves, but we're not naming any names, and there's no particles. And then we've got the other camp of scientists where everything's particles, and things like particle wave duality to describe light. So that's where in my confusion comes in, because I know that light, charge, gravity and magnetism are one in the same thing, but I can't separate them out to try and make it simpler, as if I wanted to teach somebody else.
Yes,
from the beginning.
Excellent. Well, let's pretend we're 5-year-olds. Now,
Yeah.
first of all, we need to remember our religion, that anyone who does not believe in the unified field, like physicists who think gravity and electromagnetism are separate, we recommend hospitalization for schizophrenia. For the rest, who understand that it is a unified field, what that unified field is made of is charge. The compression rarefaction of that superfluid is named plus and minus charge. Very simple. And that charge always travels toroidally when it's quantized. And specifically, light, for example, is quantized in a toroidal photon. And our physics of color, phase conjugate cause of the existence of color, starts with understanding the photon is toroidal, just like ball lightning. So that we're beginning to connect now the photon to charge. And in terms of electricity versus voltage, electric versus magnetic, the unified field of charge says that when the charge is traveling as a photon, which all charge does when it travels, or it don't travel. Another way to put that is, if the only thing you got is smoke, the only damn thing you can make is smoke rings. But on the surface of the torus, the part of the charge which is traveling perpendicular to the vortex, you could think of as the voltage, which is specifically only a name for pressure, tension, as Tesla well knew, whereas the amperage is only a name for the amount of flow. So it's totally hydrodynamic. The amount of pressure and the amount of flow in hydrodynamics is specifically more than metaphor. It is the only physics of the difference between voltage and amperage. But now the difference between the electric field and the magnetic field, as you said, is simply 90 degrees. So the amount of that flux that's measuring the centripetal implosively, the magnetic component. So we measure the magnetic component differently than we measure the voltage component. So some New Age woo-woos think the electric field is separate or somehow a different stuff than the magnetic field. That is also schizophrenia for sure. So now we're at least, and as far as the particle versus wave theory, we can deal with that very simply. What we can say is, whoever conceived of the concept of particle was a mistake. Particle is only a name for the fact that the amount of charge is quantized because it travels in slip knots. Remember, when that charge rotates, it stores inertia like a gyroscope, which is the only definition of mass, period. So you measure the amount of stored inertia and we name it mass. But the word mass is a delusion because simply all we're naming is inertia. And that inertia exists because charge rotates. And similarly, when that charge rotates, it has a period of rotation named time, which is only named for relative spin rate. Only. All this crap about time-space is bent. That's just to confuse the teenagers. No, the reason time speeds up when you accelerate is because the spin rate speeds up. You accelerate a donut as it's going through the ether. Of course, at the center of the vortex, some of the charge acceleration will be experienced as spin rate increase called time. So now you've linked mass and time and the photon, and it's all very simply connected once you understand the nature of the unified field, which is a superfluid of compressible charge. How are we doing?
Yeah, we're good. I think because there are other people define mass as things like light slowed down or
Well, it is light, but
ether
photon, it's
condensates.
charged. It's not just
Yes.
slowed down. It's the rotation of charge that's been concentrated in a slip knot. So when the rotation is concentrated, that's called concentration of inertia, otherwise named mass.
And then that would be the same as ether condensates or plasma.
Ether is simply a name for that compressible superfluid charge, nothing else.
Okay, that's because sometimes what happens is, because with that explanation you've given with the donut and the torus, that's going to easily help to explain how photosynthesis happens and biology can tell the difference between a color. But then when we're learning about the charge vortex and the up and down waves going in and then the compression waves coming out, people's brains now can't connect the donut to the up and down wave to the compression. That's the thing which I thought people following might get stuck with if they wanted to learn this as well.
So we have the many pictures, but maybe I can
Yes.
bring that up here. So I'm going to do the share screen one more time. We have some lovely pictures. This is going to be the keynote, tour stock, no, keynote, gain energy during charge collapse. Share one moment. See if I can get my show together here. Doing this on the fly. So the side view of that vortex. So down that vortex from Charlie's East there, which is actually Schauberger's vortex, if that water is piezo, then that vortex will, the charge of the water at the center of that vortex can actually make a spark. And that water will gain energy during charge collapse called implosion. So that ability to implode charge, which is the basis of our imploder technology, is the introduction to your beautiful question. Let me see if I can get the right picture here. So the side view of that vortex, oh, here we go. Okay.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Because we were talking about up and down waves going
Yes.
in, and then
Yes.
then the donut came in,
Yes.
and and I think really with that cone you're talking about, millions of waves would be all trying to get in, and only certain ones
That's right.
go in.
Exactly. Yes. So we're seeing now the side view of the vortex into the donut right here.
Yeah.
And notice that the only wave that survives that implosive compression named PlanckFire.com, which by the way is, we have proven, the only way hydrogen is built. So the side view of those 10 golden spirals on that perfect 60-degree implosion cone, which is the cone that connects the infinite pent-dodeca in 3D, the only possible three-dimensional fractal. Again, the geometry of hydrogen, DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, and the universe is all dodeca. So that 60-degree light cone vortex side view, you see the caduceus, that is the path of optimized translation of vorticity, which is a name for the principle that the transverse wave entering on the left, going up and down, as it goes down, only the correct vortex, the transverse inertia, is efficiently translated in vorticity down the light cone, so that when it reaches the throat of the nozzle named Planck, it has been efficiently compressed and accelerated, and that acceleration is named the gravity. This is the only definition for the gravity, which is the experience of acceleration, which is the adding and multiplying constructively of the phase velocities. So if I take this top-down view here, I have 10 golden spirals, and they add and multiply constructively wavelength and phase velocities. And when the phase velocities heterodyne recursively constructively, then the compression is converted into acceleration of charge toward the center. The name for that process of generating acceleration of charge toward center, only because of fractal golden ratio, is named the gravity. So the name we have for gravity is a name for only the generation of acceleration of charge towards center because of fractal recursive golden ratio. And so when those phase velocities add and multiply, out the nozzle of the squirt comes the compressional longitudinal EMF on the right-hand side, as Bearden efficiently proved is the only definition of what a gravity wave is made of. So we understand now that transverse to longitudinal is actually the process of how a charged vortex makes gravity, and our film with that title just had almost 50,000 views.
Yeah, that's great. So, because I think we've explained it in sort of a simple language and with a picture. When it comes to embedding in the big array, this inertia, it must have to go back the other way. And then we've got the nodes where when I was learning, it's talking about waves bouncing. So I was wondering, in my little brain, thought are they mirrors? So how does the wave bounce correct on the correct node? Because we've got the information coming in, and then now we're in the big array, and
Yes.
and then somehow we've got to get the information, say action at a distance, back out again. So the process must go backwards to get a transverse wave back again.
That's the idea. So the idea is that, remember when Kozyrev and Korotkov placed the Kozyrev mirror, which is just a microwave coherent cylinder, and they're placing these giant microwave cylinders, and they measure in nanoteslas the crossing of an Earth grid magnetic line to know in advance where you can put the Kozyrev mirror if you would like military quality telepathy measured many times. So that physics is very simple. That microwave should have been tuned to ATP 1.91 angstroms. They didn't know that at the time, but we now know the physics of telepathy absolutely is simply fractal coherent longitudinal interferometry between those nodes. And the physics is that when the transverse wave comes out the squirt gun, when the longitudinal wave comes out the squirt gun, the longitudinal wave will go through about anything, especially including a Faraday cage, except when it gets to the next compressional node, as you say precisely, bouncing. So when it gets to the next longitudinal wave, only there does again the longitudinal electromagnetic exchange inertia with the transverse. If you ever used a microwave to make phase conjugate interferometry, which the Germans knew pretty well when they knew how to paint the nozzles of their periscopes to prevent radar bouncing. That's the secret, by the way. Anywho, so the nodes of that array are the places where you can exchange that inertia. And so that is where, on the nodes called sacred sites of the dodecaecosa Earth grid, it's the only place, not just the only place wherever they got high quality telepathy measurably, but that is the place where Bruce Cathy measured dramatic reduction in nuclear critical mass. We now know that this defines nuclear critical mass because the longitudinal node is obviously the compression. For example, implosive capacitors named the Ark of the Covenant reduce radioactivity measurably, as does focused human attention. It's so fun, actually. So we know the opposite of radioactivity if we could make implosive capacitors. And Reich used the wrong term for that. He called it orgone. And the biogeometry people use the word biogeometry. This is words used by people who don't know what a capacitor is. Implosive capacitance, which defines orgone and defines biogeometry, is specifically this ability to make charge implode. And that is not just the opposite of radioactivity by definition, but also why seeds grow. So bouncing at those nodes is absolutely, and that then is the mechanism of all action at a distance for sure. And physics using the term entanglement instead of the correct term, phase conjugate embeddability perfected, is a better word than entanglement. And when they call it Einstein-Rosen bridge, what they mean is the nodes of the longitudinal array. And if they understood that, then they wouldn't have to call action at a distance spooky anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're having this conversation about, is there's so many words for the same thing.
Exactly.
Which, we haven't even, we haven't said wormhole or black hole yet, but I think to clear up confusion for people, because I think even just mass confuses people. Sorry, yeah.
Yes. But the day we measured, replicably measured, just before Jean-Charles Moyen repeatedly teleported with witnesses, came back with sand between his toes. And by the way, going to the beach is a pretty good place for your first teleport because it's a longitudinal node. He always went to the beach when he started. But the point is, we measured his brain waves. You can see the measurements, flameinmind.com/lucidbrain. Incredible high amplitude coherent EEG cascade from alpha to gamma, golden ratio implosion, just before he teleported. The highest amplitude cascade from alpha to gamma we've ever. I can make high amplitude alpha, but I can't quite climb to the gamma, so I'm not such a great lucid dreamer, actually. But anywho, golden ratio implosive phase conjugate EEG cascade measured repeatedly shows the ability to teleport. Well, at lower amplitude, that's called lucid dreaming. In both cases, it's called embedding into the array. And that array is the physics of ancestor memory, collective unconscious, communion of saints, that sort of thing. So
yeah, because you actually read my mind. Because one of my questions I was going to ask you about was about memory, but maybe before I ask about that, just to recap for people, the whole physics that we're describing describes gravity, which is vital for life force, but also we're talking about telepathy would be moving information at a distance. And also then about bilocation, because actually Jean-Claude Moyen in school apparently used to disappear out of the toilet cubicle. So there's witnesses here, there, and everywhere.
Girlfriend was involved a few times too. It was
yes.
Charge the battery of yearning.
Because it's sometimes once you know the physics, it doesn't matter the thing that you're moving. So, but then in terms of so telepathy, we've discussed information or the inertias being moved. We've defined what mass is and how we could move mass or a person using this method, and ending up on a node or wherever they go. But then when it comes to lucid dreaming and remote viewing, that's a slightly different idea, because we haven't talked about yet our plasma vortex in our heads, our consciousness in our array, our synapses being able to leave. So for people who are interested in learning these things, because I think learning to teleport might be a bit of an achievement.
Let's not go there yet. That's for the advanced class. Good point. No, but I could say luciddreamteam.com, you can see the measurements from the university research that proves the frequencies most likely to cause lucid dreaming very close to golden ratio times Planck, planckfire.com, which are the frequencies we measure and teach in brainwaves, which are the frequencies exactly we use in our plasma, the Therify and now Firey.com, which replicably, there's a whole site on the blog of Therify, we triggered lucid dreaming. So not only did the university study agree with Planckfire, and the Planckfire frequencies in plasma trigger lucid dreaming, and lucid dreaming is probably the best way to predict who's going to take memory through death. Therefore, who has a soul, hint, suggest we practice. But that it simply means the experience of that implosive compression to densify and then allow the aura to become radiant into the longitudinal array, the embedding into which is the ability not just to lucid dream, but specifically to take memory through death. And we use many of that in our recent films with Sasha Stone and others when we discuss the measurable physics of how to release stuck ghosts based on the same physics. We know that successful death is simply a black hole of compression. Witness the Heinrich Kluwe form constants, lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, seen by all the near-death experiences, or the Templar ritual, lost art of resurrection, which is simply how to do death experience very well. So when you do that implosive compression and you inhabit that larger array from within, the introduction is called lucid dreaming. The climax is called successful death. And successful death is not an oxymoron.
Yeah, because that's the thing. We can all learn to access a bliss state because everything begins with the bliss state and us becoming coherent. And then everybody could learn to lucid dream. And then also I need to plug Tony Rodriguez because he's the one who's teaching me remote viewing, and anybody can learn that. It's not inaccessible. Then
Tony's our
telepathy.
buddy. Yes,
Yes,
yes.
and telepathy, I think a lot of people already experience this. And Rupert Sheldrake's talked and studied telepathy a lot. And then my goddaughter is she's a non-verbal autistic. So interesting communication happens between us. And I'm sure people listening have had a telepathy moment, and lots of people have had a lucid dream. Some people may be dubious about remote viewing, but we've explained now how it's possible to
Yes.
shift. And then we forgot to mention the children in Russia who can see without their eyes.
Yes. Yes, yes. So these are all, so, but just to back to Tony Rodriguez. So he helped, I was teaching him how the physics of the longitudinal array worked. He
Yeah.
had already observed that obelisks function as nodes to enable better remote viewing. And his school of remote viewing followed his SSP experiences. Tony was quite a guy, and he did the virtual reality teaching of how to, we met inside this in virtual reality. It was really fun, which is the nodes of the array. But he showed that the distance then between the longitudinal node called the obelisk and the water was predictable and measurable, fit the equation, because the obelisk, the longitudinal node, was used to charge the water as he then he's making and selling obelisks, and as he charged the water with our firecrystal.com to heal his girlfriend. So yeah, that's exactly right. It begins to understand that the same implosive longitudinal array coherence, which is telepathy and remote viewing, then introduces us to the physics of clairvoyance. And as you say, the children who see without their eyes. So it was actually Korotkov who first inspired me. I've known Korotkov for many years, GDV, old buddies. And he was the first. He was with the St. Petersburg World Without Blindness Project. And his job was to go to the place where they taught kids to see without their eyes. And the kids were taught, imagine yourself in beautiful nature. You don't have to be there. You just have to imagine it well. And your body flips an electric switch and you get fractal. and that electrical switch means, your body getting fractal means, for one thing, that the brainwave harmonics enter golden ratio. And that originally was Korotkov's discovery, really. He didn't implement it very well, but then we implemented that elaborately at flameinmind.com, the ability to teach golden ratio and EEG, and that defines consciousness. Consciousness is the ability to implode that liquid crystal vortex in the synaptic array, Indra's net. And the implosion of that plasma liquid crystal vortex in the synaptic array then explains also, for the first time, eat your heart out, Gary Schwartz, the physics, and I do mean the physics, of how you take your consciousness outside your body. Nobody's explained that before. We have explained it beautifully. You got this plasma vortex imploding inside your head. If it's coherent enough, and you got dozens of medical surgeons who documented being outside their body and looking at their body from outside, well, Gary Schwartz, how does your physics of consciousness people explain that? I can explain it perfectly. The plasma vortex imploding, just like ball lightning, has propagated into the array. And by the way, when you're traveling outside your body, do not try to play with steel and aluminum boxes, because it'll kill you. This is the physics of ghosts, because the plasma cannot implode. So you won't even get orbs or living plasma in the wrong dielectric, steel or aluminum. So this then introduces the children who are seeing without their eyes, because this golden ratio cascade in brainwaves identified kids who can see without their eyes. And we've been teaching that for years, as have many, but we're the only ones that teach it using brainwave biofeedback. And that's the turning point, when you can teach the young people how to make alpha, because then they start getting that cascade, they get the bliss, they get the implosion, they can see without their eyes, their lucid dream. And the thing that's cool is the kids who start seeing without their eyes, they start getting clairvoyant and they start seeing their dead grandmothers. And in the West, the parents freak out. In the East, the parents say, oh, no problem. We understand. So this is an introduction to the physics of clairvoyance as well. Another good introduction there is with the new PhiRay.com, that super powerful magnetic coil with the world's most powerful Schumann cascade. And when you relax and get still and then focus in the center of that magnetic coil, multiple people have the experience. Suddenly, they can see through their body. The array that is the physics of clairvoyance is embedding in the longitudinal nodal array. So you can see through your body and you look like X-rays, and you can find your electromagnetic slip knots, I mean, your problems. And so that understanding this longitudinal coherence is also an excellent intro to clairvoyance. Remember, the kids who saw without their eyes, they got clairvoyant. So you see how these all fit together once you understand longitudinal coherence.
But also that's really important what you said, because you're describing sort of psychic surgery or psychic healing, and then about
Exactly.
how pain can be a fractal that's broken and leaking charge, or an organ that's disharmonic, we should say.
Exactly.
So I think it's something that, I'm very fond of with people in the right brain world or the woo-woos, and they've been talking about psychic healing for ages. They just never had strong
Physics.
science to prove it was actually true. So what you've provided is a
Yeah.
scientific explanation for things a lot of people might say, oh, well, I knew that anyway, but I didn't know how. Then back to people who
Well,
may have...
just to comment there, though. So at PhiRay.com, PhiRay, PhiRay.com, we have the history when I invented phase conjugate magnetics with Elizabeth Rauscher, when she showed a phase conjugate cascade of magnetic harmonics, measurably replicably reduced pain in her FDA studies, which is now the centerpiece of PhiRay.com. So it's literally centripetal force. And even the piezofire.com, I think you have one there. We had people with hernia pain, and like 10 minutes in multiple people with serious hernia pain, immediate relief. So this was an introduction to the physics of pain. Thank you. So we put the phase conjugate cascade, the piezo harmonic from Planck fire, actually flame and sound harmonics, the Planck fire harmonics, into the piezo oscillators, then through a super dielectric shungite there. And then the pair implosively conjugates centripetal implosive capacitance. And the center sweet spot between them is where we eliminated hernia pain. We started realizing we have now proof the physics of pain is the opposite of compression. In other words, the fractal gets broken, it bleeds charge, and you name that pain. So if you restore efficient compression, it is the electrical opposite of pain. That's the principle. Whether it's phase conjugate piezo electric there with piezo fire, or there's another pair that's supplied with piezofire.com, PIEZO, PHIRE, piezofire.com. The other pair is supplied with a bifilar Tesla coil, which is a flat inductive. So magnetic or implosive capacitance, either way, centripetal implosive is the opposite of pain. And that's the point, that when you restore compression, and the restored compression, it's not just, oh, I told my body to stop hurting me. It's more than that. It is. And by the way, we've had some bone regeneration there. I have to say, these are anecdotal reports. We don't make medical claims, but
The
it's
thing is,
amazing.
I think Robert O'Becker showed a long time ago that all bone healing is to do with current anyway. And I was just about to bring that up about the bone healing is perfectly plausible with
Yeah,
the
the bone is
science.
piezo. And I was
Yes.
in Syracuse in Robert O'Becker's lab. He was very nice to me. And he showed the moment of tadpole tail regeneration, the cartilage, like bone regeneration, was responsive to a weak bias DC voltage, which obviously is creating a compression field. And that was the trigger of the threshold at which the tadpole could still regenerate its tail against all odds, was that weak electric field, which organized. And that's why bone is so responsive to this piezo. So I interrupted you there at that point. But
It's fine because also with Dr. Dean Bonnelly, who's passed away now, he knew a lot about magnetism, and he built a bone healing chamber to do with magnetism. It got dismantled, same as Wilhelm Reich's work got destroyed. But then I wanted to loop back to your phase conjugated magnetic device, because it's back to us and me trying to understand magnetism, gravity, electricity, and light. Would you be able to talk a bit more about phase conjugated magnetism? Because just for people watching, this would be phonons. So we're doing sound here, and sound's already a compression. So it's quite easy to understand how this works. But then maybe the new device, the magnet, if you could talk a bit more about how that works.
Yes, so that's at phi rate. The device you're showing is piezofire.com,
Yeah, this
and
is,
the magnetic there. In fact, if I go here
yeah.
and go to the phi ray website, which is here, so just to look at that coil, this is what that coil looks like. Maybe I can go to a bigger picture of that coil. So we take this Schumann harmonic cascade re-perfected from the theoretical 7.29 to the actual 7.83 hertz here, which are the frequencies we measure in the pyramids, which are so healing as well. And we feed that very precise, but much more harmonic rich, broader phase conjugate golden ratio heterodyne cascade to this coil right here at rather high amplitude. We make a really strong magnet, but that magnetic wind of implosion is literally the best cathedral you've ever been to. The best cathedral, obviously, is the one that implodes the most Schumann. It's really rather simple. So people experience this very cool breeze, magnetic wind, as a kind of blissful cocoon. In fact, the words they use are grounding, blissful cocoon of magnetism. And here you can stay still and focus it on your heart or whatever part of your body. So here you're in the presence of the plasma fire, the phase conjugate plasma there. And now in phase with that phase conjugate optical noble gas plasma, you have, first of all, the transformer here with the electric strong field, and then the magnetic field here. And then you focus the magnetic field on whatever part of your body, and it's very blissful on your third eye. But the point we were saying before is if you keep that still and you relax and focus in the center of it, that is where multiple people have had that experience of clairvoyance, of seeing through their body because of that implosive magnetic phase conjugate, magnetic field, which is just Schumann amplified off the charts. That's what it is. So the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave. Oh, yes, and you have your plasma thing there. I'm going to turn this off because you got your gadget there. Very nice.
But that,
yeah.
I think what you just said about seeing inside your body is really important because another thing practically we can all do is feel empathy and the recursion or the recursive waves and turning things inside out. This is another important part of this physics, and we can all be empathetic.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So we have been saying for years the old story about I would turn myself inside out for your darling when I invented the physics of realheartcoherence.com. We knew that the heart is a imploding magnetic field. And when you take the power spectrum of the EKG, that's how I invented the physics of heart coherence. And I taught Heart Math Institute how to take their first EKG, how to spectrum analyze. And then I taught how to measure internal phase coherence, the second order power spectrum called the cepstrum. And what we realized was that when you're measuring internal phase coherence with a second order power spectrum, the peak on the cepstrum, the amplitude of the peak of measuring internal phase coherence, that peak going up and down is a functional lie detector. And we used it on stage with hilarity many times because, if he says, "Will you marry me?" and you're checking his heart coherence, it's a funny story, but it's really true. If his heart coherence goes up, he is telling the truth, actually, because your heart's turning inside out recursively, implosively. So the power spectrum, the harmonic content, will become harmonic inclusive, which is the only medical definition of immune health, harmonic inclusive heart rate variability, named fractal. So harmonic inclusiveness obviously is perfected by golden ratio because that's the only way the harmonics can interfere constructively. So when your heart harmonics become inclusive, which defines the fastest way to measure immune health, actually, the more harmonic inclusiveness, also the thing that's so cool is it is literally what we refer to as pure intention, because that implosion defines which waves are shareable. theshareablewave.com, our friend Shelley. So these things fit together beautifully. It's actually embedding into this array. And that is the physics of compassion, because when your heart turns inside out for you, darling, what you really mean is, I feel you inside of me as me inside of you. It sounds rather Sufi, but that the beginning of that perception of empathy, which is very close to the feeling of bliss, it's because the very nature of life force is a shareable wave. That's why on 9/11, when 3,000 people died, the Princeton Noosphere Project, they call it a Josephson junction, how they measure global emotion. They don't know that their Josephson junction is just a way of measuring longitudinal interferometry. They don't know that. Somebody might want to tell them someday. So that longitudinal node that they measure with a Josephson junction, which is just supercapacitance, actually. So the wavefront of the longitudinal array is measured better by a Josephson junction than a normal capacitor. And that's why the Princeton Noosphere Project was able to measure the pulse of global emotion on 9/11. It is literally the distribution. And that's why you cannot die successfully without embedding into that array. And you will be then appropriately tested whether you contain a shareable wave, thus able to be compressed if you wish to die successfully.
That's led me into my next question. So first of all, about using this science we've been talking about for our memory. Say if we want to learn something, because the memory isn't in our head, so we must have some kind of array where we can, and some people are better at remembering things than others. And then it's being able to retrieve things close by. But then it leads into the next question about getting memories from a past life, which a lot of people can. And then I think Dahlia, you've interviewed her quite a lot. She's gone all the way back right to the beginning to memories from Thoth. So maybe if we could talk about, just in simple language for people, the first bit, just for children or anybody who wants to learn things better, this kind of physics can be applied to improving your memory. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah. And in fact, the definition of how much soul you got is
Yeah.
the definition of how much long-term memory you got. It's called Ride the Long Wave, Uncle Joe and Surfers of the Savuya. So the longest wave is, and it's true that the longest wave of racial genetic memory, the turning point when, as a race, the species turning point. Obviously, if Enki, his name was Nunibud, which means the cloner, he was the chief genetic engineer of the Anunnaki. So, I had, 20 years of Kundalini, and then I wrote a book on Enki, and then Sitchin did the same thing, and I wrote a book. And then Anton Parks had Kundalini, wrote a book on Enki. Well, how come everybody? And then Enki's partner, Thoth, who's actually the guy who designs how souls propagate. And so taking the root of ancestor memory, which is the root of fractality, which is that turning point of implosive embedding, lies with the intent of when our gene pool was shaped. And for better or for worse, that does have to do with the Anunnaki and Enki and Thoth. Absolutely. And Thoth is defined really by the physics of what he called the caduceus, which we call phase conjugation. So you see how that all fits. And Thoth actually is the name of the bloodline later called all the kings of Egypt. Thothmosis means sons of Thoth. It is the name of the ancestry of every holy grail bloodline there is. It is the name of the line of David in Egypt. The line of David means Tahuti, which means Thoth. It is the name of the bloodline of Atlantis. I mean, Thoth, it really gets around, man. It is the name of Viracocha Quetzal. It is the name of the guy that Hancock kept bumping into every time he did an ancient apocalypse. And the same guy came up to save civilization every single time for Hancock. That guy was Thoth. And they called Apkallu, the team. So understanding their intent, and their intent was actually simple. And since you brought up Dahlia, who's wonderful, incredibly dedicated, she's in Egypt right now, and we'll be doing more work. But one of the climax messages there actually was, since we're speaking of Dahlia, one of the climax messages, and he taught her how to redeem the souls of whole graveyards at a time. And he taught her how to save the souls of children whose schools were surrounded by 5G antennas eating their soul. He taught her how to fix that, and I'm grateful, damn it. But anyway, so one of the climax messages was, look, kids, this here was an experiment. And the experiment was simple. The harvest, the success of the experiment is how many kids get a soul and therefore can go through stars. And actually, you know, stars like our sun need the birth of souls because that's what makes them centripetal. That's how stars grow up, is they need human consciousness to make the like when a million children sang the same song 11 times, they measured dramatic peacefulness in the solar flares. What's the physics? Our sun needs something, the evolution of souls. Well, what Thoth is telling us, it's a pretty simple message. He says, well, after X number of thousand years, if this here little experiment ain't going so good and not enough kids is going to have a soul, there is going to be a plowing under. It's normal. You know, the solar system is really not stable. The sun has to burp occasionally. And the gene pool cannot be saved unless there is enough collective soul, hint, enough kids who have a soul to have the kind of centripetal force to make their stars implode coherently. In other words, if you're Osiris and you ain't inhabited the sun, you get fired. So the point I'm making was simple. It's telling us there's only a limited number of years left before some of the next solar catastrophe, and our gene pool will not be able to be saved unless there's enough, well, I say young people, enough people in general who have enough soul to, you know, it's like a collective shamanic lucid dreaming team to save the planet, to become centripetal, get centripetal or get dead. So the message was simple. Look, this experiment, the people who arranged this experiment used the fact that now they're destroying the souls of billions of children with this shitty Wi-Fi Bluetooth 5G crap that's chopping up the souls of a billion children at a time. This ain't fun, man, because our scientists don't know what a soul is. It's really bad news. Anywho, the actual, they call it the seeders, who planned this experiment to see if we can make souls here, do not have a lot of patience left. It isn't about patience. It's simply about efficiency. If we can't get it together and teach our kids to have a soul, sorry, kids. And it's something on the order of 10, 20, 30 years. We got a little time, and right now, our information is more than 2/3 of the planet is already soulless. So sorry, but I think that's pretty shitty myself.
Oh no, it's terrible. So it goes back to my introduction of what I do now. So working in quantum biology, the idea is to get people out of artificial blue light and pink light, get more people outside in the sun, get people grounding, because all of what we've talked about, if somebody is not interested in buying anything, all of this is available for free as well, because you can go outside. There's the sun's plasma, the sun's phase conjugated pump waves. We've got sunrises, sunsets, UV light. And it's about not just stopping people putting earbuds in their ears and living on watching TikTok and cat videos all day. There's also encouraging people to go out in nature again. And I think that's one important thing
bliss.
which we can all do. Yes. And teach people this stuff, because it does sound really outlandish to some people what we've talked about, but it's completely normal. So I've just brought it back to sort of a level to say that it might sound terrible, oh no, all the souls are going, but other people can help as well by helping people to reconnect with nature, take children outside more, stop having the electronic iPad babysitter. So yes, it's kind of like a...
And the tragedy, just to emphasize the tragedy here, that when the many experiments were done, if you take the horrible pink light fluorescent poison out of your kid's classroom and install sunlight, you have a dramatic, measurable increase in attention span. Well, hello, the tragedy is that our scientists do not know why. That's the tragedy. Because if they understood what created attention, what attention is, the physics of that implosion, the harmonics of sunlight is just the beginning. The opposite to attention is Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, electrosmog, metal building crap that's destroying the souls of our kids. Do you know that in Finland, when they taught the kids to go barefoot, the academic performance went through the roof? You know what that's called is grounding. So now they understood a little bit about what the electric field that causes attention is. If that were teachable, we might have a chance.
But that's back to people think that grounding's woo-woo, and we've obviously got the magnetic field outside. So in simple language, we just tell people when you're grounding, you're collecting electrons, which is fine for simplicity to get people interested. But in terms of what's actually happening when we stand barefoot, what's the correct
That's right. That's
explanation?
yes. So grounding is a name for access to fractal charge distribution for both electricians and psychologists. That's the definition of grounding. What that means is when I took my shoes off, I was hot in the Santa Barbara health food store and stood sweaty feet on the wood floor for the first time, standing in line. Just at that moment, the person in front of me and behind me in line turned to me at that moment and wanted to initiate a conversation. Do you know why? Because when I got grounded, I became the centripetal center of the conversation. I was literally fractally attractive. So when you walk barefoot in the mud and on sacred stone or in the river, what you do is you embed in the array and become centripetal in the array. And that reminds me of the time when I forgot to meditate before I left the lodge at Canandaigua, and the dog chased me down the road. The dogs know when you do your job and do your meditating because they feel you in the array. Yeah, anyway, it was a very lovely Syrian dog, amazing story. So
Yeah,
the point is when you get grounded, you get the leverage on the array. Absolutely. It's so critical. So get the damn thick rubber sneakers off your feet and get something like leather that can ground your feet, and then walk on something other than concrete with metal rebar in it and get grounded. Read the book Earthing. The book Earthing is very appropriate. It's in fact, it's the only way to really take advantage even of our plasma technologies is to get grounded afterwards, for sure.
yeah, there's actually publications in PubMed as well about it being one of the best anti-cardiovascular disease tactics. Then the other thing about going outside, what about the physics of sunrises and sunsets? Because isn't there very interesting
Exactly.
four-wave plasma mixing? And then
Yeah.
we can all go and see those. Like, there's different ways to talk about the benefits because there's obviously lots of violet light and there's healing red light and near infrared. But maybe if you add some of your knowledge onto why seeing a sunrise and a sunset's very important. And our ancestors all knew about the sunrise. And then the breatharians talk about, and I believe them, eating the sun.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. It's food. If you do it right, it's food. Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, so it reminds me, we had 3 days in a row, we saw the green flash at sunset in Perth. Well, the green flash is the fractal phase conjugate physics of rainbows for sure. And that also explains why you measurably see more rainbows when Tibetan saints die, or actually Aboriginal saints, because the centripetal force, their death adds to the atmosphere, is the physics of rainbows. So basically, the reason Agnihotra, for example, works so fabulously, it creates fertility, it healed Bhopal, it healed Nagasaki. The Agnihotra, precisely at the second accurately of sunrise sunset, because that right angle called phase conjugation
Mm.
enables embedding into the longitudinal array, obviously. And that was called four-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics, but it's called the sacred four directions in ancestral, indigenous peoples. But it's the same physics. So that the sunrise sunset is just the beginning. So all of the things that increase embedding into the array, sunrise sunset, equinox solstice, being at a magnetic line cross point, all of these things which determine where nuclear mass is affected, determine where a cathedral or a labyrinth or a plasma can work, or where telepathy is going to be successful, or determine where birth or death is going to be successful. The nodes of that array, that physics is a good introduction to how to inhabit the larger mind. Absolutely.
Yeah, because luckily near me, there's four very old churches all in a line. I looked on Google. So, you can, because for people who are saying, well, I don't know how to dowse, how do I find a sacred site? If you're in the UK and Europe, we've got lots of really ancient buildings. But then I think people can also look at Becca Hagen's grids. I think there's an interview with about Becca Hagen's grids, because that's another way where people
Yeah.
can get an understanding of what we're talking about. But also, if, like you said, a cathedral, or there's churches here that are like 300 to 600 years old, that would give people an idea. then the next thing I wanted to ask you, where I live, there's the churches, but somebody's built a rail track.
Oh
Um,
shit! Oh
so
terrible!
how much damage does a railway cause? Has it ruined the grid line completely,
Right.
or is it only near where the grid line is?
We think it's an evil Draco plot. No,
Okay.
if you read Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, Daniel Pessoa, the installation of the railroads was the death of the grid. Really, a simple introduction. When you're driving along in Joe Cell's Brown's gas implosive hydrolysis car running from imploding hydrogen, if you stop over a railroad track, the damn thing is going to quit. You know why? Because actually that implosion is disabled because of the poisonous dielectric of that steel track, actually, which even in, I think for 1,000 years here in the sacred city in South France, where um, uh, Saint John Trophimus, who was the son of the Black Madonna, Magdalene, about whom the Da Vinci pictures were painted. When he melted the stone platen of his coffin with his knee, like Sambhava melted the stone with his hand, and then the Roman army carried that for 10 years, for a decade actually, which was later named the Holy Grail. That was done at a very specific graveyard in Arles, where he proved that he went through death by taking his plasma with him and melted the stone with his aura. And that's the origin of the Holy Grail story, quite literally. Now, several hundred years later, when they installed a railroad track directly through the damn sacred graveyard in Arles. Now, for 100 years, the biggest business of that town was every other European in most of Europe demanded to go to the town of Arles to be buried. That was their biggest business in the town. Because if you get buried there, then you can join the Grail. So everybody wanted this. Well, now they put the damn steel railroad track right through the graveyard and destroy the only business that actually made that town go, like the metal roof they put on the cathedral in Scotland. Anyway, so the point is, yes, the steel railroad track is a serious destructor of a biomagnetic life force for sure. It's the steel is pretty fatal.
Because you've mentioned many times about the successful death. When I interviewed Professor Robert Temple, who's wonderful, he wrote a good book on plasma. He also talked a lot about different definitions of the soul and René Descartes and the thinking substance. And I did ask him, can he remember some of his past lives? Because, you know, when you meet a polymath, you think they must have had like 10 lives already that they can remember. So when it comes to, say, someone who's never thought of what this successful death, if I manage to die outside on a sacred site at sunrise in a really loving, good mood and embedded successfully, does that mean that when I come back again in the physical body, I'll remember everything from the life I've had, or is that too simple?
I think it's a good introduction. By the way, I think Temple does great in saying
Yes.
that plasma becomes self-aware.
Oh,
But I
I was
don't.
going to go there.
Yes,
Yeah.
but he's really enthusiastic, which is great. But I don't think he's actually considered the physics of what makes plasma self-aware with this obviously phase conjugate implosion spectrum analysis, PlanckFire.com. We're a long way ahead of knowing exactly how plasma becomes self-aware. But still, he's very
Oh,
enthusiastic.
he's wonderful because you know
Yeah,
I was talking in the beginning about some physicists are very particle orientated. That
yeah,
Professor Temple likes, and no, I absolutely adore him, and I think his book's brilliant.
yeah,
And I don't, and I was going to ask you as well about the Kordylewski clouds, but he said totally that the plasma can become self-aware. My plasma balls
yeah,
could make
that's
an
right.
entity, and then ball lightning's telepathic, and
Yes.
we've gone on for ages about it, but then there are other camps of scientists who say that we've just made up plasma and it's just more sort of dark matter nonsense. So with plasma, in the beginning when I was learning, I thought it was the same as the ether. But then what Professor Robert Temple's talking about, the fourth state of matter, the plasma, which is ions and hydrogen, maybe if we could talk about
Yeah, no,
what it
I
is.
think no,
Yeah.
his description of what plasma does not fit the known physics that plasma is 99.99% of the universe. So how can he describe plasma as only certain particles? That's crap. Actually, plasma compressed is what a particle is. That's more the physics. And saying plasma is one kind of particle is pure crap. Plasma is a cloud of charge. That's what it is. And when the cloud of charge gets compressed, then you call it a particle, but it's still made of the same stuff. Hello. So he's a little stuck in the particle schizophrenia, actually, I think, as you will.
I think as all his, I'm not, we're not saying anything against anybody, but I think this idea of making particles, as we've said many times, is a massive problem of why people can't understand this, because as humans we always like stuff, and I think that what you've said is really important, and it loops right back to the conversation at the beginning about when I said I don't know what mass is and you described it. So I think it's back to now the plasma balls that we've talked about could make a negative ion wind or a cloud of
Yes. Oh, yeah.
charge.
Yes.
And then people who like angels, and which is great, we could talk about sort of self-aware plasma, but maybe if we talk about it doesn't matter if what Prof Temple thinks plasma is. He's opened it up to all of us, and he did say it was self-aware. But in terms of phase conjugation and physics, what does that mean? Self-aware plasma.
Where Temple loses it is where all of physics loses it, which, normally plasma originally in physics was considered a cloud of charge, and that cloud of charge would not remain a cloud without heat. Now that we know that cold plasma is some of the most magic stuff around, then you have to ask, well, if I got a cloud of charge, whether it's hot or cold, then you need to ask, what makes it self-aware is the same thing that's making it centripetal. Now, please go ask Robert Temple what makes a cloud of charge centripetal. I'm sure he has no clue, actually, and therefore could never actually know what made it self-aware, you see? So once you know the origin of centripetal forces, how today's conversation started, then you can know what makes a cloud of charge centripetal, like ball lightning doing telepathy perfectly. So that's because the recursive implosion at the center embeds it in the longitudinal array. That's why that toroidal plasma donut does telepathy so well, called ball lightning. So that now that we know what makes plasma self-aware, implosive phase conjugation, connecting it to the longitudinal array at center. So until you can discuss what made it centripetal, hello, Mr. Temple, we love you, but you don't have a clue. I'm never humble, so.
Oh no, it's fine. It doesn't matter, because as my PhD supervisor always said, I'm not insulting you, Sarah. I'm insulting your data, and that's how you have to accept that it doesn't. We're not, and the same with, as much as I revere and really admire Rupert Sheldrake, and I think he's wonderful with the morphic field.
The sweet guy.
Yes,
but he doesn't know what capacitive coupling is. And capacitive coupling is actually how the morphic field communicates. There's that famous book on phase conjugate dielectric called Alice in Barium Titanate Land, that a phase conjugate field over here is always going to talk to the one over there. And it's because they're phase conjugate opposed. And that kind of capacitive coupling is the physics of the morphic field. And I'm sorry, but unless you're a bit of an electrical engineer, you can't even have the conversation, Mr. Sheldrake. Again, I'm not, maybe I'm too much.
I don't know. I think it's something that it's all correct, and it's one of these things we can't know everything, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about this, because it also validates what Prof Temple and Dr. Sheldrake have said. It's not that they're wrong.
We're agreeing.
It's just sometimes, and this is where I'm at, I still have to grapple a bit with what's something that's diamagnetic. Sometimes people talk about loss of magnetic permissibility is the opposite of a high dielectric. So all of us do battle with these electrical terms, and I think it's something that to understand that they're real physical things.
Yeah, dielectric constant was simply a name for charge distribution efficiency, what can inhabit capacitors efficiently, which is how you make all zero-point energy devices, for example. And phase conjugate dielectrics are the beginning of all phase conjugate optics, for example, barium strontium titanate. Whereas magnetic permittivity, which Callahan pioneered, was a magnetic field permissivity by which you could predict where war versus peace are going to break out. which is permissive distribution of magnetics. So these terms work very well, but they are quite specific and a bit of electrical engineering background. But Sarah, we left one of your questions
About
about,
the hypnosis.
well, about am I going to die well and remember when I come back?
Yeah,
You have
or have you, or can you remember your past lives already? Because that's what I wanted to ask. Because I did, and I wanted to like know all about them, and that's the thing. Yeah, so we can come back to that. And then there was the hypnosis question that I was
yeah.
also
Well,
relating to that.
hypnosis we can deal with simply. Mesmer, for example, to be mesmerized simply meant to embed in the plasma field outside yourself. So if you became centripetal enough to embed in the plasma field of another person, you could be their steering wheel because they are a plasma tornado. I'm mesmerized, which is exactly the romantic physics of falling in love. What vortex did you just fall into? Your boyfriend was entrancing because, the imploding aura, which is very close to saying the only aura that implodes sustainably actually has pure intention, which leads back to, which means a shareable wave, which leads back to the excellent physics, which the Sufis would say, you only fall in love with pure intention. Whoever can feel the longest wave. But that might lead us back to your question then about,
Because with the hypnosis, because I used to do hypnosis and stage hypnosis, and people
me too, me
they
too.
weren't pretending to be riding a giant chicken that was laying a square egg, or thinking that I'm Madonna, or their hands stuck to their head, or whatever else. It's not. It's that's why it's we're not talking about relaxer therapy. We're talking about actually making someone think that the chair's invisible. Or the furthest I ever got was I probably tried everything, and I've never made somebody ever think they've gone blind. You can make people think they're deaf, you can do all sorts of things. So people who don't want to believe in this, that's fine. But like you said, somebody's vortex tornado has completely,
Embedded.
yes, it's taken over. So whoever's got the biggest, or would you say whoever's tornado spins the
Implosive,
fastest is gonna.
most implosively has that power. And ultimately, I mean, initially you could say, obviously, there's all kinds of room for evil, for bad intention, for screwing things up here. But in the long term, the theory would be that your aura cannot continue to implode unless actually you're imploding into the shareable wave, the grounded
Hmm.
collective unconscious. So ultimately, you can be a black magician for a while, but eventually nope. Only pure intention is ultimately going to survive because that's the only sustainable implosion there is. So there could be a light at the end of the tunnel here in the sense that the people who get really big auras, remember, when St. Francis of Assisi went down to meditate in the forest with Claire, the whole town called the fire department. They saw the plasma flames. And those guys, they did have pure intention. They were literally sweethearts. But I think we should get back. I want to get back to your question about, will I remember when I come through birth? That question you asked, we
Yeah.
didn't do that question.
But also, right now, how do you know so much about everything?
Well, I don't know a lot about. Look, electrical engineers spent 30 years teaching the physics of consciousness and 30 years having intense Kundalini, I suppose. I've imploded a little bit, and I needed to figure. I didn't start any of this because I wanted to teach somebody. No, I started all of this simply because I needed to understand for myself. Literally, I spent several months weeping and crying when I had Kundalini, and I literally sorted every unshareable emotion ever, which is a good way to prepare to die, which is a good way to prepare for immortality, really, which is the Templar lost art of resurrection. My father had a near-death experience. I had a Kundalini experience, same effect, really. But anyway, how did I?
Because that's the other thing. So you know a huge amount, because this is all back to the other questions about memory. So you were able to embed, and we'll just call it politely, accessing source and getting downloads. So you're able to get a lot of information that's in the collective that was there already. And then we talked about memory and how it's the same physics. So you were able to retain it all. And then in terms of what happens next with you or me or anybody who has a successful death, what does that, will you be back again next time round?
or is it a pain in the ass to have to come back? Well,
Yeah.
remember, so for me, when I had that I fainted in the gold sarcophagus of Tutankhamun in Cairo, and I remembered how they used him for rainmaking. And I'm a bit of a rainmaker myself.
Hmm.
And then I realized that Tutankhamun was a name for the bloodline of Thoth, as was Jesus actually.
Hmm.
And I don't say I'm a reincarnation of Tutankhamun. I'd never say that. But a fragment of the soul memory, yes. And so that's why I identify so well with Dahlia and others who are teaching the actual mission. And I do mean not the fairy tale, the personality. No, the scientific mission of what Thoth Tahuti is about. I identify with great.
Because if I had to guess, I would connect you to John Dee.
Well, Vincent Bridges said I was John Dee, and I certainly have a fragment of that
Yeah.
story. Yeah, the the mad wizard making the tornado that took out the Spanish Armada called the Tempest.
But also, and there's a lot more to John Dee.
Yeah,
Anyway, and the
that's right.
whole we can't go into the whole Edward Kelly story. But then we did mention gold at the beginning, and to cut a long story short, some of the information they got was how to make the best gold. So is that because this is also interesting to do with when people have past life regressions and sort of Dolores Cannon's work, is how much of it is somebody's imagination and how much of it somebody has actually got a piece of, like you said, a piece of someone's soul that was John Dee, or the other people who do I like Moses or the Balsham Toff and all of these kind of amazing people that just keep coming back and back. And how much of it was that you actually that person, or is it like a glimpse into the soul memory?
Well, Valerie criticizes me because I criticize astrology, and John Dee spent most of his life being astrology, and I consider a lot of that. Not that astrology that doesn't have good physics, but at the time, good physics did not much inhabit astrology. But John Dee was studying the physics of scrying,
Mm.
which was how to reach into ancestor memory, like the coding Nostradamus used on his water cup to see the future. So that was a phase conjugate mirror. Yes, thank you, thank you. And
The dangerous, yeah, yeah.
yes, and so the physics of scrying is prehending the longitudinal array.
Yeah.
That's why the obsidian mirror was ancestor phone call. The physics of scrying is actually coherent longitudinal interferometry. John Dee was studying how to call ancestors with scintillation in scintillating light. John Dee was studying how to call ancestors from pinhole mirrors. Those are all points of conjugation from
Mm.
which the array is accessible. So John Dee really did not have a clue of the physics, no, but his intuition was leading him beautifully in the right direction. So I don't consider John Dee's life story or even his anecdotes essential. No, but I think the physics of where that goes is gorgeous if you understand how scrying is actually the physics of clairvoyance and how ancestor memory is that longitudinal array you can inhabit in the obsidian phase conjugate mirror they called his showstone. So by studying the physics of scrying and inventing actually longitude versus latitude, many things, John Dee was on the right track. And so I admire that path, and I see my present life as a cascade, not into those specific memories, no, boring, but as a cascade into the physics of the pure principle of where that goes. That is immortal. And it has nothing to do with names or personalities. Oh, it was fun, yeah, let's talk about personalities. But actually, the physics of the pure principle is the only immortality here. The personalities are just a boring sparkle that, comes and goes. That's okay.
So when you talk about pure principle, do you mean absolute truth, that kind of thing in a
Yeah.
human that all of a sudden when we hear something, we're like, oh yeah, that's definitely right? Or do you mean doing everything from a seat of love for the benefit of everybody?
Well, the seat of love is the seat of perfect embedding, the seat of compassion, which is the seat of what inhabits collectively that array, whether you want to call it source or spirit. Remember, we know tens of millions of advanced cultures around the galaxy and tens of billions of galaxies. And the advanced ones, all believe in source and spirit, and none of them use the word God.
Mhm.
No, it's boring, childish. But understanding the pure principle of how that array is inhabited by self-awareness, by the array of the collective unconscious and collecting shareable memories, which is survival physics, which is the only way you get into death. That's a pure principle.
Okay. Just I know we've got limited time. With obsidian, what's special about that from a electrical engineering perspective? Why did you use did he use an obsidian mirror?
uh, it was an Aztec mirror that the showstone of John D. and Kelly. And by the way, John D., like me, was pretty lousy with clairvoyance, really. I'm clairaudient, but my clairvoyance is limited. But to teach the physics, yeah, I can do that. But the obsidian mirror, I suspect, had not just the high dielectric quality, which allowed charge implosion, which is the high dielectrics is the physics of basically all phase conjugation, including optics and magnetics, really. But also then the surface of the obsidian mirror, uh, approximating how a phase conjugate mirror works, allows prehension, coherent embedding into the longitudinal array, just like I think there was a black coating under Nostradamus's cup of scrying water, which is how he saw the future. So this is literally implosive conjugate optics and dielectrics, which enable ancestor phone calls from things like obsidian mirrors.
Okay. Then another materials question, because we've talked about hydrogen a lot, and I wanted to ask you about deuterium, because from a biology perspective, which I am a biologist, we know why it's bad for mitochondria and it's a problem when it accumulates in the body. But in terms of your hydrogen radii paper and hydrogen making gravity and all the physics we've talked about, what can you say about deuterium?
The deuterium bond is super valuable energetically, for one thing. If you want your Brown's gas Joe cell to make high wattage in your HHO, get a little deuterium in there, man, and the energy density goes off the charts. Well, that's because the deuterium bond, the two fractals can marry. It's very much like saying, well, what makes the gold stable as a monoatom? Huh?
I was just about to ask you about monoatomic gold.
Well,
Anyway, I'll
yeah.
let you
So
finish
what,
about the deuterium.
which is the physics of the origin of Holy Communion and the Ark of the Covenant, which was
Yeah.
implosive capacitance, the sacred ark, the mercy seat. Well, how did the gold atom become stable as a mono? Well, how did the hydrogen atom become stable as a monoatom? And then how could it bond? This is all literally and only the fusion, fractal fusion physics of alchemy. And we have equations for every commercially usable isotope transition in the atomic table, silver to aluminum to silver being only the example, thanks to Bill Donovan. So we know the physics of alchemy. It is absolutely the physics of fusion, which is the physics of non-destructive charge collapse. And with that, you can write the equation for the critical temperature and frequency for every alchemic fusion reaction in the whole atomic table. And that spreadsheet is huge, thanks to Bill Donovan. But so the physics of alchemy in this fusion is like the ark in the Ark of the Covenant, stabilizing the gold monoatom, making mana, the origin of Holy Communion, exactly like the carbon arc that was the beginning of Tesla's whole career, which is fullerene's phase conjugate carbon. And so these are implosive centripetal phase conjugate electric field devices, that arc. And that was called a mercy seed because the plasma would sit there. So, and then why did every pharmacy in Europe sold mummy powder for 300 years is because it was high in monoatomics. Well, it wasn't because the Egyptians were eating monoatomic gold. No, it's because mummification was a conjugate dielectric capacitance, which alchemically transformed the tissue of the body into a rhodium iridium emulet, literally. And that is how the aura could then inhabit the body longer. Like when a Tibetan dies, if it's a saint, you put a thin film of gold around the Tibetan saint for the same reason.
So back to the deuterium. Is it more or less implosive than hydrogen? Because if everything's tuned properly, just before I move into the gold again with deuterium, just in terms of implosiveness, or does it make more or less gravity than hydrogen?
Um, Hydrogen will probably remain stable as a monoatom
Right. Oh, I
only
see. Oh, okay.
only in the right capacitive field. Visualize the Ark of the Covenant, for the same reason the Ark would then reduce radioactivity, which was its original function. So if you didn't have available that implosive capacitance, like the Ark of the Covenant, sacred space, to keep your hydrogen or gold monoatom stable as a mono, then you could store them in the twofold deuterium
Oh,
state, I
oh,
would
so,
guess.
so with deuterium, it can't exist as a monoatom. It's like
That's right.
unstable. Okay, and that's why there's different reasons of why things are bad for biology. So the instability of it can't just sit happily like a hydrogen or a
Yes.
monoatom. It's trying to do something.
It's all about getting stable. It's just why if you have enough bliss, you may not need to be married, or if you had enough kundalini. So the really powerful person is perfectly blissful by themselves, as you must be at the moment of death.
Okay. And back to the gold, with Hudson, and I think I mentioned it before that not being an electrical engineer, I got very confused about the monoatoms having ceramic-like properties, and then learning more about dielectrics, that would mean it could be potentially a superconductor. And then the rest of the physics about gold and levitation or gold disappearing and reappearing sort of lost me a bit.
They called it unobtainium in the movie Avatar, and it's floating. Hello.
Yeah.
Well, the same reason those insect skeletons floated,
Mm.
because the capacitance of the bone in that insect became such a super dielectric that if you formed it then into concave structures called the uh, cavity structure effect is the technical term for why those insect skeletons floated. So you got two things. You've got super dielectric, and then you got the symmetry of that array into visualize Valentines. So you
Okay.
arrange the moleculars of super dielectrics into the Valentine's nest, and suddenly they float like that city over Jupiter, which is floating. Well, floating rocks are super dielectric, whose concavity makes them capacitively implosive, which is then fits the monatomic gold floating. But there was another part of your question about uh, the superconductance. Well,
Yes.
um, um, two things. One, David Hudson got confused because his only way to prove that he had made monatomic gold alchemically was the high temperature spectrum analysis, and they would spectrum analyze the vapor cloud burning. And at first, everyone who did the spectrum analysis of monatomic gold thought it was silicon, what you thought was ceramic. They thought it was silicon because they didn't know that the temperature of the burn had to be high enough to identify the difference between the silicon spectral emission and the actual monatomic gold. So it was actually a problem in the spectrum analysis of the chemistry that confused David Hudson. Is silicon gold? Well, actually, it's just the frequency signature of pure implosion. But
Mm.
David Hudson had a lot of problems. He had chemical problems, but his major problem was actually not understanding that you could not create immortality in people by feeding them gold powder unless you taught a little bit about the physics of pure intention, looking for a heart of gold and growing old. We knew him, so
Oh
that,
yes, it's very interesting because it's like there's like other Dr. Alex Ling makes monoatomic gold, and there's
yeah.
like natural form and chemical form, and
That's right. And that difference is, and by the
yeah,
way, priestessalchemy.com,
yes.
Chaz, who made the monatomic gold for Patrick Flanagan after I introduced them, is very good at that.
Mm.
So Hudson's source was purely chemical. And that stuff, a little bit of David Hudson's stuff could burn a hole in your aura that was serious astral hygiene problem, actually. Because David Hudson didn't understand the spiritual side of this, I don't think. Oh, he was a sweet guy. I mean, he tried hard, but there were many issues, chemical pollution.
If you've burned
Last
a hole in your aura, can you fix it again?
Well, it's sort of like my friend Pam, who was teaching meditation for many years. She said, well, the people who came here, they all have huge holes in their aura, mostly from too many drugs, actually. But she said, well, it's a matter of having enough bliss, which in most cases is many years of meditation. What it means is the asymmetry in the implosion at center is what determines if you have holes in your aura, real astral hygiene, and therefore susceptible to parasites. So to restore that symmetry means you have to create that suction from within. And that is the willpower associated with years of meditative practice and focusing. I mean, there's kind of no shortcut or substitute for pure intention, actually. So holes in the aura from too many drugs, for example, require years of focused meditation and assembling pure
And, and
intention.
and also, before people think we're making stuff up, Dr. Korotkoff has got
Yeah,
the bio well, and he's been measuring auras.
exactly. That's what
I've
we're
met
referring
him,
to.
and he's massively scientific. He's got 300 papers, and he does everything in
Yeah,
triplicate. You know, the classic perfect science, and all
yeah.
of his work on structured water or telepathy or his bio well. It's not somebody just
Uh,
messing about. It's
yeah, no, he's wonderful. And the GDV is becoming a little closer to replicability, although it's
mm,
still, you spend a little more now, you get a little more replicability. But the concept is perfect. The symmetry of the capacitance, and he agreed perfectly that when we measured fractality in the aura, he measured fractality in the aura, and we did spectral measurement of harmonic inclusiveness in the capacitance, which is how we measure life force, flameandmind.com/life force. He and I agree perfectly. We are both measuring the same thing effectively,
mm,
which is charge implosion. It's real. But just in your question about the superconductivity in the
yeah.
gold, I just one last thought in that regard was
Yeah.
that uh, after we learned that a small dose of lightning in the primal soup, I mean, a little spark of implosive capacitance will turn a thread of gold into a superconductor and will turn a thread of DNA into a superconductor. And the physics is instructive. Tom Sawyer wrote a paper on that. But the practical example would be Dannion Brinkley's two or three near-death experiences just after he died from lightning. Everyone he touched, he saw a flash of every peak emotion of their life. It's a real story, his books. And so his DNA had literally thread become a superconductor from the thread of lightning that hit the gold filament or the DNA filament at the moment of crystallization, meaning implode the capacitor and the thread would implode centripetally, and it's just like Kundalini, really. So the reason a thread of gold or DNA becomes a superconductor at the moment of the bolt of lightning go through it when it's crystallizing is instructive to the physics of bliss, and why when you have bliss, implosive recursive braiding.
Didn't Tesla got struck by lightning, didn't he?
He did, and it was a turning point in his insight. Absolutely, if it don't kill you,
Yeah.
And in other words, if you can survive death, then you're really alive.
And then just one more thing about electrics in the body. With something like melanin, which could be a semiconductor or a superconductor, could melanin superconduct or semiconduct? And in terms of biological semiconduction, how would you describe that properly for us?
That I probably don't have the right real expertise, but I would have a comment anyway.
Yeah.
And that is to say that my study about how the implosive phonons, when Kundalini climaxes, we measured the phonons imploding on the
Mm.
ventricle horns. You become horny, and
Yes.
that focuses the phonon on the pineal. And that triggers a whole cascade of superconductive glandulars, including probably melatonin, etc. So, which is the physics of clairvoyance and the physics of bliss process and the lighting of the pineal. My pineal gland burnt like a red hot torch. It still does. And you can feel negative ion wind, and the top of my head has a point on it. I mean, this was Kundalini, And so we knew the sweet dripping on the back of the tongue when that was happening was the triggering of the distribution of those glandulars, including, I assume, melatonin related. There's harmaline and there's a whole cascade.
Oh, yeah, I meant melanin, like
No,
the
no.
tan, but it doesn't matter because it's the same question. So, in terms of just in simple language, what's a semiconductor? Um,
Well, a semiconductor refers to the fact that the transistor uh, um, it functions as a very fast switch. And so you can use a very low bias voltage on one axis to switch a very high amperage on a perpendicular axis. It's just a name for a switch. That's what a transistor is because it's a semiconductor. And that means you can use a little power to switch big power. That's the origin of computing, really.
that's a brilliant answer because about semiconductors in the body that you need some kind of
Switch, yeah.
input. Yeah, so I understand now because
That,
you
that's
mentioned.
that's how my career began because I
Yeah.
was I was the designer of the polygraph in the psychophysiology clinic with Al Axe, one of the inventors of biofeedback, University of Detroit psychophysiology lab, and I was the electrical engineer doing the polygraph. And I was there when the I used to tell the story way too much, but when the college teenagers watched Playboy magazine for only 2 seconds and you measured the conductivity in GSR, that transistor was fast, man. The resistance, by the way, went down. So Playboy magazine resulted in reduced resistance across the fingers, and the transistor was faster than any switch we knew of.
Um, if I wanted to learn, or people wanted to learn more about electrical engineering, because I read one of your books of recommendation, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, which is really good
Then,
for learning about wave
then talk.
mechanics,
Yes.
because a lot of this, will, my head's blown in a nice way. But then in terms of learning about electrical engineering, just in general, to be able to follow your work and other kind of things, what book would you recommend?
Well, first, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Ben Bentoff, who adopted me, and I helped him with his polygraph there in Boston when he was measuring the low frequency phase lock between the EKG and the spine liquid pump and the bliss
Mm.
phonons in the brain, capacitive accelerometry, which was his beautiful physics of Kundalini for sure, is a beautiful start on this. And actually, when he said stalking the wild pendulum, he meant, oh, where is the still point? How can
Yeah.
you stalk it? And the still point is, hello, now I'd like to answer your question. The best book is called plankfire.com.
Okay. Oh no, that's fine. It's just because in terms of learning these electrical definitions, I think it's very important to be able to understand. But I've tried to make for people listening that hopefully people who are not electrical engineers could follow and get something out of it. But yeah, just the Stalking the Wild Pendulum book's a good start for people. I know his description of gravity isn't correct, but it
No,
doesn't matter.
no,
Just
but
just ignore the gravity bit. Yeah.
well, but
Yeah.
the reason the body makes gravity, which is called get centripetal or get dead, is you
Mm.
get more fractal. And that is so well identified in the power spectrum. Bentov was taking the frequency signature, but he didn't realize that frequency signature of Kundalini, for example, and the bliss phonons and the binaural beats. That's all phase conjugate to Planck, absolutely, which is all charge collapse perfected. So that means you're imploding, and that's absolutely how you make gravity. And that was a bit beyond Bentov at that time, but he was an absolute hero.
He was. He sadly died under mysterious,
Great
unexpected.
Chicago plane crash, and we know
s-
all the stories. I studied in detail.
Yeah, it's very
We could go
sad.
into that, but that'd be another two
Yeah,
hours.
exactly. It's just more to give
He
people.
called me his guardian angel at that time.
Oh, right. So you've been a guardian angel and John D. So
Well, I don't know. Maybe if I wasn't that good, but actually the story was that he wanted to go on. It's a long story, but he was joining the angels as a story. But the conspiracies are not right there. The engineers who didn't control the jack correctly that held the removed engine on that plane overnight know exactly what caused that plane to crash. And conspiracy doesn't work here.
no, it's clear it's sad because I don't know what he would have become if he could still be with us.
Well,
But
remember, he was on the opposite sides of the Arab-Israeli war with Puharich, and Puharich was kind of his nemesis, and I knew them both very well. And Puharich is the one about who later caused the Star Trek series to be written, actually, when he first talked to Enki Atum Thoth Tom. So, and I was there. I mean, so that's how those communications began. And that's a whole nother long story.
yes, it is.
Only Planet of Choice is the title of the book.
Yes, that's great. Anyway, you've been massively overly generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. And I've got a better understanding of your work. There's still things that I need to work on a bit, but I can't thank you enough for this opportunity.
I love your questions and the sincerity, the passion of your own inquiry. That in itself is pure intention, which inspires me,
Yeah.
really. Thank you for being passionately ready to inquire. You're
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
may we both become a shareable wave.
Yes, exactly. Yes. May we both implode together. Yes.
And I hope someday my accent is as interesting as yours. But anyway,
Anyway, thank you. I'm sure we'll see each other again. One more thing, because you have a conference every year, don't you? It was fully booked last year, and I couldn't go. Will there be one this year?
we're cooking. We're hoping to have our own center to do it at. Hold
Oh,
your breath. It's cooking. It's cooking.
okay.
Stay tuned.
Okay. Yes. Stay tuned. Anyway, yeah. Thank you very much.
Blessings, Sarah. Thanks so
Thank you.
much. Blessings. Bye-bye. Bye.